Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. In this week's episode, I'm interviewing Kristin Stephens-Martinez. In our discussion, we chat about learning computer science in large classes. So for example, Kristin has classes between 200 and 300 students. We also discuss the winding and challenging journey through education and research, and how the end product looks a lot neater than the actual process that was taken. We discuss recognizing the importance of representation and providing support for underrepresented identities, the benefits of peer instruction, Kristin's podcast, the CS Ed podcast, the disconnect between research on education and practice in the classroom, and so much more. In our discussion, Kristin mentions multiple books and podcasts, and if you go to the show notes, it has direct links to each one of those. And you can find those show notes by clicking the link in the description or by simply going to jaredoleary.com and clicking on the podcast. I hope you enjoy this interview, and I hope you take the time to listen to Kristin's podcast, the CS Ed podcast.
So my name is Kristin Stephens-Martinez, and I have a Ph.D. from UC Berkeley. And my research is in computer science education. And so the way I define that is I'm interested in both the learning of computer science as well as the using of computer science for education. My interests are mainly in computer science introduction, so the first and second kind of classes that you would take in computer science, as well as focusing on how do you scale learning? And so what I mean by that is, how do you add another student to the classroom without affecting the quality of the learning that's already happening in the classroom? A lot of people kind of assume small class must equal better. I want to challenge that assumption by actually asking, well, how do we know? Let's actually check and let's do some experiments to find out where this idea of small equals better is that actually not true. And you can potentially take advantage of computers, take advantage of scale to be able to teach more people. Because as a teacher, you really want to teach as many people that are interested in learning. And we're often feeling so limited by the quality of the learning that we want to make sure is happening. And I just want to push the envelope a bit more and trying to understand, how do you help more people learn what they want to learn? So that's my research. And then the other thing is, I am also the host of the CS Ed podcast, which is a podcast that more focuses on higher education, computer science. But the main reason why it doesn't cover something like CSK through 8 or 12 is because I don't know anything about that space. And so I didn't want to step on any toes or risk making claims that made no sense. So that's why I more focus that podcast on computer science, higher education and college, but it's not like I purposely omitted that area of CS Ed.
So I'm curious, what are some of the perceived benefits of working in small groups, and how do you incorporate some of those in large scale classes?
So probably the biggest one that people always think of first, I suspect, is the personalization aspect of things. Mm-hmm. The classic 2 Sigma paper where if you are in a regular classroom, you perform a certain amount. And then if you had a small group or something, I think the paper basically goes, if you had a tutor, if every single person had a tutor, they would perform 2 Sigma, 2 standard deviations better than if they were in a normal classroom. I think it's the classic paper. I think the paper is from don't remember, maybe the 80s or something. It's actually a pretty old paper at this point. And I think that's the first thing people think of, where they're if it's a smaller classroom, that means that the teacher can really get to know every single student. And then on top of that, they can personalize the learning much more for that student. And in some ways, I agree. That's true. And it could be that for a specific student, they really do need that personalized attention from a specific teacher, and they develop that relationship with that teacher to really be able to get to the learning that they want to get at, which I think is perfectly fine. The thing that I balk at is assuming that that must be better and is always better than any other circumstance.
Right.
I mainly teach introductory computer science classes at Duke University. Should have mentioned that too. I am an assistant professor of the practice at Duke University. In my introductory computer science class, the way that I try and help my students have more personalized interactions. So the class has 200 to 300 students. But they have small labs, which are at most 25 students. And those labs are run by 2 TAs. So it's a pair of TAs together that run and teach 25 students. And so that's more where some of that one-on-one interaction is going to happen. They are also encouraged to work in groups in those labs. So they get some other personalization by talking to their peers. In lecture, which is where I get all of them, I do a lot of active learning in my class. And so when I say active learning, that means things like think, pair, share, where I ask a question and I ask the students first, think about what you think the answer is. And I want you to turn to your neighbor and talk to your neighbor what you think the answer is. Another one would be peer instruction, where I pose a question and they have to actually answer the question. It's a Google form. So they have to go to the Google form and like punch in their username and then answer the various questions and hit submit. And then I take a look at how the students did. And usually they don't do so great on the form. So like clearly they've fallen for the wrong answers. And so they tell the students, turn to your neighbor and discuss the answers. And since basically all undergrads I feel like are competitive, I sometimes tell them, try to convince your neighbor you're right, which usually gets them to start talking a bit more. And there actually is a bunch of literature generally, and some literature only in computer science, that shows that this discussion will help students get to the right answer. It's more likely to happen if at least one person in the group does have the right answer, but it still is beneficial to a certain extent, even if neither of the students have the right answer. Sometimes I try and prompt the students by asking, like, if you already come to a conclusion, now I want you to also discuss why is the right answer right, why the wrong answer is wrong, just to try and get them to keep discussing, and potentially for the group that actually are on the wrong answer to realize that they're on the wrong answer. And the reason why I call that personalization is because every single student is having a personalized conversation with someone else. In the ideal world, of course, it would be great if they had a conversation personalized with me, but at the same time, potentially not, because I'm an expert in my field and I suffer expert's fallacy, just like every expert would suffer under. And expert's fallacy is this idea where you have forgotten what it is like to be a novice if you're an expert. And so that means you have forgotten what a novice is likely to struggle with. You have forgotten what is it like to struggle in a specific way when you're trying to master a concept. And on top of that, there are many different ways a novice can struggle with a different concept or a difficult concept. And what is beneficial for having a TA, which is also an undergrad, or a peer right in your classroom, is they are a novice with you. And so they also are more likely to understand what you're not getting because they just potentially just went through it. And so that's one way I bring personalization into my class, despite it being a very large class, by taking advantage of peers can talk to each other. And that scales as the class gets bigger because there are just more peers that people can talk to. While I don't scale because I am one person among 200 to 300 students. Like I tell my students sometimes, they're like, don't rely on me, go find a friend. There are 300 people in this class. I'm sure you can find a friend.
So they're able to share with each other their understandings. How do you personalize the assignments in those large classes, though?
The assignments, unfortunately, right now, those are not very well personalized.
Mm-hmm.
And that honestly is because of the logistics of grading. Most personalized one that we have is we have an assignment called the Turtle assignment. And so a turtle is basically a drawing program where you can draw whatever you want. And you have a little turtle that's like the pen. You put the pen down, you draw whatever you want. You can pick the pen up and move it around and draw. And so for the turtle assignment, we tell them, draw whatever you want. It just needs to have 2 colors and 3 shapes, something like that. And so that gives students a lot more creativity that they can do. I've seen students do super simple things, and I've seen students do extremely complicated things because they just got super into the assignment.
Right.
And it just was a case of like, you can do whatever you want as long as you fulfill these simple criteria. For us, it also, we have extra pieces so it's like, you have to write this function that draws this thing. Now write the code that will call this function 10 times and draw it 10 times across the screen, like trying to get them to get to certain aspects. And so when we write unit tests for that, it's easy to write unit tests for certain parts of that. And then I have a group of undergrad TAs whose job basically is just to grade those things. Mm-hmm. And so they're like downloading code and running it locally and like doing this over and over again to like check to say, are there 3 colors? Are there 2 shapes? Okay, you get full credit for this piece. So that's kind of unfortunately the closest thing I have right now to personalization in my class. And some of the other things that I'm toying with are things like, it's not really on maybe the production aspect of what the student is doing, but I've been thinking more about metacognition and scaffolding things like time management for students. Mm-hmm. So I'm just currently reading a paper that did 3 different interventions to help students with time management. 2 did not work and 1 worked. And the one that worked was the emails that the emailed students reminding them, you should be probably at this point in the project. And if you're not, there's a problem. And you need to now try and like catch up because everyone else in the class is like, you are here and the class is here. You probably need to work on things a little bit more. I'm only about halfway through the paper though, so I don't exactly know what they said, but they basically like the email was the only thing that really helped students to turn things in sooner and on time and like actually get stuff done and pass more tests and that kind of thing. So I think that's more what I'm currently toying with personalization, of trying to figure out how to help my students with getting stuff done on time and thinking through how they can learn the content in a more almost like time effective manner.
I'm wondering if you could, just kind of thinking out loud, if you were to work with another colleague either at Duke or somewhere else and be like, okay, we're both or all of us are doing a unit on, I don't know, conditionals, just throwing it out there. I'm going to create an assignment that requires students to write code that's like create a game where if you score a point, this happens. If you get hit by an enemy, you lose a point. Or a colleague could be like, okay, we're going to create a choose your own adventure. So if the user chooses this, it goes into this part of the story and it branches out. Otherwise, if they choose this other thing, go to this other thing. Or like just different assignment variations on whatever the topic is. In this case, conditionals. If you could all kind of like combine that and say, here are like 5 assignments that are all the same thing, and it's used across like you and 4 other colleagues, then is that a way that could be personalized? So you're like your TAs, like one TA would be assigned to the first one, and then another TA would be assigned to the second one. And so that way students have some sense of choice and can kind of pick projects that are more relevant to what they want to do, and then still use and understand the concepts in your class while not making it so you have to develop 5 different tests and whatnot.
So there's a couple of thoughts that come to mind for that. So besides assignments, we also have problem sets. So it's like implement this function. And usually what we do is like we give them 6 to 7 and they only need to implement 5. So they can kind of choose whichever ones they want to do, with maybe a couple required to make sure they like do at least one set problem, do this one, do at least one problem in dictionaries. The other thought I had is this is very much a moment that I feel shows the difference between higher education and K through 12. Because for us, I'm the only one teaching Intro CS. No one else is teaching Intro CS at my university. Like there are other ones who will teach it at a different semester, but I'm the only one teaching it this semester. And we kind of pass the curriculum along. So it's the same assignment almost regardless of what semester and who is teaching it. If I wanted to do this idea of asking other people, like what projects do you do for testing these concepts, I'd have to go outside to another university and ask them, like, what assignments do you have for testing these things? ASIM is taking on an existing project, and the name is escaping me right now, but Brianna Morrison and Michelle Craig made this project where people could potentially submit their assignments, like they would submit to a conference or something. Mm-hmm. And then make those assignments available to anyone who wanted them after they go through a peer review. Basically, I think the purpose of Michelle and Brianna's project was to make it so that more people could basically do a nifty assignment. Like more people could submit to this and it'd be peer reviewed and anyone could use them and that kind of thing, with a certain like probably level of rigor for both unit tests and what you kind of get when you download the assignment and be able to like deploy it in your class. So that's one avenue that I could think of. I don't know how many people have submitted to that particular website though.
Yeah, and for context, when I was in the K-8 space, I was the only computer science teacher in my school. And then when I taught general music and band, like I was the only band director, I was the only general music person at most of my schools. So like we had this issue as well where it's like, okay, I'm the only one doing this thing. How do I communicate with people across the district or elsewhere? And then when I was teaching like undergrad and graduate courses, is the same thing. Like I just collaborated with somebody in Toronto about how to create like a coding and music unit for their music technology class. And so like having to reach out and do that, it was just kind of like one thing that kind of came to mind.
Yeah. I was just like, when you said like talk to the other teachers for other assignments, I was like, but no one else has other assignments unless I go outside my university.
Right.
We use the same assignment with like mild tweaks every semester to prevent cheating. Though I'm currently reading a book on grading, equitable grading or grading for equality. I can't remember exactly what the title is anymore. And I'm more and more suspicious of like the processes we go through to try and prevent cheating and trying to like think through what would be a better way. But admittedly, like I'm only maybe a quarter through the book. So part of me is still cynical about the idea of like figuring out ways that like students will learn because they want to learn. And I'm like, yeah, some of them will. I was one of them, but like most students aren't me.
Yeah, lots of things to consider when designing stuff, educational experiences, whatnot. I'm curious, what's the story? How did you get to computer science education? If you were to write a book about your entire story, like what would the chapter titles be?
Definitely one would be getting into computer science. And then the next one would be going to grad school. And then probably actually the CS Ed one would be a separate chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Just because each of them has a distinct kind of reason it happened, or it would all be like at least subsections within a single chapter. So I got into computer science purely by accident, which is one reason why I don't think the story is good. I will get into why I think it's a bad story in a minute. So when I was in high school, I finished my freshman year, my first year of high school in Illinois, and then my parents moved to Maryland. Illinois requires 3.5 years of physical education. Maryland requires half a year of physical education. And so when I arrived at Maryland, I suddenly had this extra period in high school that I had to like fill. I was like, what do I do? And my parents happened to move to one of the richest counties in the country. So that meant that my high school, which was technically the ghetto high school in the county, the ghetto high school,
Air quotes.
kind of hard to be ghetto when you're also in the richest county in the country, had a computer science teacher. And so I had full-blown computer science classes in that high school, a whole 3 sequence. And when I was looking at the options for signing up for classes, I was like, well, I saw the computer science class and I was like, well, I like computers. I like programming the VCR, which kind of dates me, but you know, I like programming the VCR. I'll try this class. And then I was like, this is awesome. I'm never looking back. This is so cool. I want to do this. And I took all of the classes. I took AP computer science, all of it. And the reason I don't think that's a good story is because I got lucky. I don't like that. I don't like the fact that I had to get lucky to find in computer science. I honestly have no idea where I would be if my parents had not moved. Like, I just have no clue what would have happened. In some ways, it's a tragedy if someone cannot find what they're interested in, if it wasn't for luck. And so I think one of the things that kind of drives me actually for computer science education is I want to help as many people as I can at least find out if computer science is what they want to do. Because if someone would have taken that opportunity if they knew it existed, but they never came across it, that's a tragedy. So that's why I don't think my story is a good one, because it required luck. And I want to try my hardest to try and figure out ways to make sure that it's not luck that gets someone into this field or gets someone into finding what they are interested in doing.
So is that reflection on the luck that led to your interest in computer science, why you went into computer science education, to try and help make it so people didn't have to rely on luck, to try and like expand it in K-12 offerings or university offerings?
So I think that's one of my motivators, but it's not the reason why I find computer science education interesting. I've actually always been interested in the process of learning and psychology and all of that. I am a learning nerd. I am unapologetic about that. Like, I watch science YouTube for fun.
Yep.
And I will tweet about it. And I will tell people like random things like, I just learned this cool thing from this comedian mathematician. And it's like, what's your favorite mega number? Like, I love this. Like, that's literally what I'm watching right before bed after the baby's gone to sleep. I message a friend via email. She's a math professor. And I like message like, this is such a cool video. This is so funny. And I'm like, oh, I'm such a nerd. I'm such a learning nerd. And I'm perfectly fine with that distinction. So the reason I got into CS Ed is more because the process of learning and all of that is very fascinating to me, which in some ways is hilarious because I also like computers because they're not messy like humans are.
Mm.
So I kind of have this like tension in myself where I'm like, computers are nice and logical. They do exactly what you tell them to do. Not necessarily what you want them to do, but at least they do exactly what you tell them to do. And then humans are super messy, but they're fascinating and complicated, and they do weird things, not what you expect. So like after I started computer science in college, I got into computer networking. And so networking was interesting to me because the internet works shockingly well, despite the fact that it's kind of held together by chewing gum and duct tape. And so this like simple rules, complex behavior was very interesting to me. And so in some ways, I'm not surprised now that I'm looking back that I found that interesting, because I was like, computers being simple and straightforward is interesting. Plus, you get this complex behavior, and I like complex behavior, so I kind of like humans at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
It's not surprising to me that that progression happened. One reason why I don't think it's quite a good story is because when you look at my CV, my resume, you see like it looks like such a happy story where like, oh, she found CS in high school, and then she got all of her degrees in computer science, and now she is a professor in computer science. And it looks like such a normal transition and flow. And if a student saw just my CV, they're like, oh, she had it together from the get-go. Like from the beginning, she knew exactly what she was doing. And I'm like, hell no, I had no idea what I was doing. I want to make sure that people understand that you can start at any point and you shouldn't feel imposter syndrome. Like, oh, I didn't start computer science from high school, so I must not be good at it, even though I'm starting it now. And I'm like, no, that's not true at all. I just was lucky. And even though my CV makes it look like I knew exactly what I was doing the whole time, that's not true. I started my bachelor's with the full intention of just getting a bachelor's, going into the industry, making a lot of money, and then doing whatever I want to do afterwards. Like I didn't actually see computer science as a means of fulfillment. I saw it as a means to make enough money that to do whatever I wanted to do. And then I made a sharp right turn into grad school because I had a professor who basically said, you need to go to grad school. And I thought about it for a summer while I was interning at Google at a very boring internship, and decided that, yeah, I want to go to grad school because I wanted to learn how to learn from academia. And I had the full intention that like, if I achieved that goal and didn't want to stay in grad school after my master's, I wasn't going to stay. So applied to grad school, got into grad school, started my master's in computer networking, transitioned between various advisors. I had one advisor who in many ways was excellent because he basically told me, you don't want to do computer networking research, which at the time was horrifying to hear as a grad student, because you had convinced yourself that this is what you want to do, because that's why you're here rather than making boatloads of money in industry. And he basically was like, I don't think you actually want to do this. And I took it seriously enough that I then started exploring. And that also was the year of the MOOC, where massive open online courses became a huge thing. And suddenly I was like, I didn't know I could do research in this. Like, I didn't know this was a thing. I want to do this. And so when I came back to that advisor and said, like, I found this thing, and he's like, this is what you want to do. Like, this is the first time I've seen you light up about this idea. And so then it took a couple more advisors to figure out actually finding someone who resonated enough to actually make it make sense. So by the end of grad school, after 7 years, I did my master's in computer networking and then had to kind of restart my PhD work completely to do my CS Ed research. It took me 5 advisors until I finally found the advisor that actually made sense for CS Ed research. Took a while. So I took longer than most people. So on my CV, it looks like I totally knew what I was doing, but I'm like, no, I was figuring it out, I was going along. At the time, everything was making sense to a certain degree. And it's actually one reason why in grad school I made this, it's called EECS Peers, EECS, which is the department's name, as a support group for grad students. So I was like, I don't want anyone to go through what I went through. Like I had a summer of depression. I saw a professional because I was like, something is wrong.
Yeah, one of the episodes that's going to release since September is like National Suicide Prevention Month, is talking about like depression, suicidality, and computer science education and whatnot. So that's like a big area. And yeah, I can relate to that. I don't know of any doc student that I've worked with who couldn't have benefited from going and seeing a therapist like each week, because it is a lot of pressure.
It is a lot of pressure, and it's a lot of pressure from both the outside, but you also put on yourself.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is because not enough of us that have gone through it talk about how bad it was. Yes, there are amazing moments, but there are also moments where it was really bad.
Yep.
And every student that ever works with me, whenever they first start reading papers, I tell them, first off, you are not stupid if you take forever to read a paper. My first paper in undergrad took me the entire day, like literally 8 hours to read one paper. And I also then tell them, the paper is not what happened in real life. Like when you read the paper, it sounds like, oh, they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly what hypothesis they were going to test. And everything flowed naturally. That's not what happened. That never is what happens. You start out with like idea A, you try to figure something out to test this idea. You end up with idea B that maybe looks kind of like idea A, but maybe not. And then you figure other things out and you like collect data, you start analyzing your data, realize that idea B does not make sense anymore. So you go with idea C.
Yep.
And then by the time you get to the paper, you're like idea G, and then you write it like you knew exactly what you were doing the whole time. And we write that way because it is the fastest way to like explain what you did. Like you only have so many pages.
Yep.
You can't go into the chronology story of the epic hero story of how you did this. You don't have time for that. So we write papers in this way. And so I tell every student, what you read in that paper is not actually what happened. It's written that way so that you can read it quickly. Do not think that you are stupid if you cannot do it this way.
Right. My chapter 6 of my dissertation has like several pages where I talk about how hard it was for me to find a framework to make sense of what I was looking at, and like pointing at all these different things that like sort of touched on one aspect, but then left all these big gaps in other areas. And so I had to kind of combine some ideas. It's a very messy process, and like the page count limit makes it seem much nicer when you actually publish things.
It's never like the way that the paper claims, because the paper is written in a very different style. Like, and it's that way by design. But like, yeah, I feel like not enough of us are telling students what the reality is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's partially because we suffer under experts fallacy. We forgot. And we also forget that novices don't know. And so with all of my students, I always tell them these kinds of things. And like last summer, I think I had 2 undergrad researchers working with me. And by the end of the summer, our project was a bust. And I told them, like, you have had an excellent, but at the end of the summer, they're like, obviously it's a little depressing. Like, project was kind of a bust. And I'm like, this was an excellent experience to find out that research sometimes doesn't work. And like, we literally tried like 3 or 4 different ideas to analyze our data. And every time we came back with like, there's nothing here. I don't think so. I don't think there's anything here. And we're like, okay, that was good. Another attempt at trying to understand our data.
So in our emails exchanges, I know that representation has kind of like had a big impact on your journey into CS. I'm wondering if you could kind of unpack that and maybe talk about what are recommendations you have for kind of improving not just representation, but like equity and inclusion in general.
Yeah, so I definitely think equity, inclusion, diversity is very important. And all the stories you hear, you should believe them. You should believe someone when they tell you that this has happened to them. My journey through computer science with the diversity, like right now I'm in the stance of like diversity is super important and we need to be proactive about it. My journey through it was, I think, very typical in some ways, where I started out kind of believing what I was being told without super experiencing some of it. And then the advantage of being raised by a white male and being half Japanese, so as part of the model minority, my parents basically raised me as being half is awesome. And so I was like, I am an awesome person. I am a hybrid. It is cool. And then I had enough self-awareness also in college. When I got to college, I remember my intro CS class looking around and like counting. I'm like, oh, 66 people, 6 girls. There's not many of us. I stood up, scooted over to the closest girl and sat down. I'm like, hi, my name's Kristin. I was self-aware enough to know that like I needed friends. I needed to make friends, so I had a community. So I think that for representation, it's important. And I think I'm still going through that journey of figuring out how best I can support it, to be honest. In undergrad, I was part of the women's group. In grad school, I was also part of the women's computer science group. And after being co-president of that group is when I founded my EECS Peers group, which is the grad student support group. I made it by recognizing that people needed support, but I hadn't even at that point recognized that one reason why you needed that support was because someone who is a minority doesn't necessarily have that network easily at hand. Mm-hmm. Like I made that group because I recognized this deficit, but I didn't recognize that it might have been stratified by racial or gender lines. I just recognized like, this is important. More people need this. So I'm going to form this group. And the group exists to this day. And basically the idea of that group is that there is a group of more senior grad students who basically are willing to put their name and faces on a website that says, if you email me, I will give you the time of day. And I don't have to know who you are. You can be a completely grad student, a completely different lab than me, but I'm willing to talk to you and go out to coffee with you to talk about whatever troubles you. Now that I'm a professor, I'm definitely having moments of like wondering how I can help people more. And this is when I wish my classes actually weren't so big, because I can't get to know my minority students without making it potentially feel weird.
And your classes are like 200 to 300, right?
200 to 300 students. I ran the numbers, and I did find at least that the Intro CS class that I mainly focused on teaching the past couple semesters racially matches the Duke University racial proportions. But unfortunately, the non-Asian white, so the minorities in computer science, are very small, even at Duke University.
Right.
Which is basically everyone who's not white or Asian. And I'm now kind of wrestling with trying to figure out like, what can I do to support the students? At the very least, if a student emails me and tries to contact me or comes to my office hours, I definitely try and like get to know them better. But unfortunately, that requires them to start the interaction. There's a clear power dynamic there. And that's also kind of puts aside all of the students who, to them, it wouldn't even occur to them to talk to the professor.
Right.
I recently read an excellent book called The Privileged Poor. Excellent book. And The Privileged Poor was an interesting book because it basically looked at two groups of students that would be classified as poor. One group was privileged because even though they were from a lower social economic background, they were able to access higher quality schools. So they got a scholarship to go to a private school or something like that. And then you have the poor students who are basically underprivileged, and they didn't have access to those tools. And so these two groups of students, demographic-wise, look the same. But in actuality, they are very different in how they potentially handle school, handle college especially. The ones that had access to private schools who were privileged poor already went through culture shock because of like how they are poor and potentially many of their peers are not. They already went through that culture shock in high school. And so it doesn't bother them as much that their peers do not understand what it's like to be in a lower social economic bracket. And on top of that, they also have learned all the soft skills and the soft rules about how to interact with adults, how to interact with professors, how to access certain resources, while a underprivileged poor student is going through culture shock during college and has no idea how to access any of those resources, potentially until their third or fourth year, when learning that is kind of too late to a certain extent, assuming they make it that far. So like that is an excellent book that really kind of helped me realize like, I cannot wait for students to come to me. Like the students I most want to help are not going to come to me because they're scared.
Right.
Small little Asian girl, they're still going to be scared of me just because I have all the power in their minds.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of currently wrestling with like, how do I get students to reach out to me more or to reach out to students in some way? I don't have answers to that, unfortunately. I'm excited that we hired Nikki Washington. She is an amazing African-American woman. She got hired as a full professor of the practice. And she has this class called Cultural Competency. And she had this excellent paper that I feel like everyone has read at this point about that. I think having her will help a lot, but I want to be careful of also the minority tax. I don't want her to have all the burden of all of these things. It's definitely a case of like, I want to do everything I can to help myself first before asking her what else I can do, just because I don't want to put that extra burden on her. I've already felt some of that burden as being one of the women in the room. Like I was recently on a committee where I was the most senior female in the room. And I'm like, I'm an assistant professor of the practice. Why am I the most senior woman in this room? And the other women in the room were the grad student and the undergrad. And so I found myself basically, to a certain extent, amplifying their voices to make sure their voices were being heard in that committee. Like, it's great that they were there. Like, I think Duke is great in the sense that they often will have a grad student and an undergrad student on committees to give that voice. But in some ways, I'm not surprised it was a woman. They're women students because women are more willing to volunteer for services. But yeah, it was interesting being in that committee because I was like, I'm not only going to voice my opinion, I'm also going to amplify their opinions. And there was one moment where I literally had to go, well, as a woman, I don't think we should do X, Y, and Z for ABC reasons. And only after I highlighted that did the other men in the room go like, oh, yeah, yeah. Well, as a man, I wouldn't want that to happen either. And I'm like, yeah, okay.
So kind of piggybacking off of what you're talking about, like thinking of learning at scale and some of the questions that you're raising, like how to help students individually and whatnot, and get the ones who are not willing to speak up. Like, what do you wish there was more research on that could inform what you do with adults?
I wish that some research was more practical, where it's easier to interpret what needs to happen and that you can implement it. But at the same time, like theory is also important. Like this semester, I'm not teaching because I'm on parental leave because I have a 5-month-old. So I'm going through a phase of, well, I have the semester off, but the summer was really my like not working period because she's 5 months old now. And so I should behave like a privileged white man who has a spouse taking care of the child and do something academically productive. So I'm like, one of my current goals is like, maybe I'll try and write a grant this semester. And so that requires me now to like go through a whole bunch of literature and research and like try and come up with a decent idea for a grant. And I'm finding that for myself, my theory is not as strong as I'd like it to be. I have a bad habit of like going, this is an interesting research question. What does the data say? And like just running into the data without really like pausing and thinking about the theory behind it. Mm-hmm. And so then I end up spending like way too long just swimming in data for no good reason. And theory is important because theory helps inform the research question, is a useful lens to help you be more deliberate in your data analysis and your like experimental design. The problem is if you get too stuck in theory, those of us who don't have as much theory background are like, I don't understand what I'm supposed to do with this information.
Right.
And I think computer science education itself, we're still a very young field. And so we're still figuring out our theory. We're still figuring out like how to do any of this. So a good chunk of our papers actually still are pretty practical. But unfortunately, they don't have a lot of theory behind them. So the cohesive whole is not there. So we're still figuring ourselves out. So for research questions on what kind of research questions I want people to answer, if I had a magic wand, I think one that would be, what can I do to get my students to talk to me if they need help? And I don't mean like help with the content necessarily. I mean help with whatever they need help with to master the material. Every semester, I probably develop a relationship with a handful of students who would then trust me enough to tell me about things that would help them that aren't directly connected to the content. Like one student, in some ways, I was heartbroken. He had to drop the class because COVID-19 happened and he had to go home. And he was struggling with the class beforehand. And then suddenly being home meant he had to take care of an elderly relative, younger siblings, and like 2 dogs. And I'm like, yeah, you cannot, in this circumstance, I strongly believe that if you put enough time and effort into it, you can kind of master anything, barring physical limitations. Some of you just might take more effort than others. So I strongly believe you can learn computer science if you want to. But he was in a position, in circumstances where he could not do that. I fully accepted it. Like, yeah, I agree. You cannot succeed in this class in your current circumstances, which broke my heart because I was kind of like, this is one reason why we have universities, to be able to help you kind of get out of that, to be put into an environment to set you up for success. Not only do I advise computer science majors, but I also, at Duke, we have these extra thing where you don't declare in your second year until your 4th semester. And so before that, you have a college advisor, which is more like a generic person that could be like a staff member, a professor, or somebody. And so I advised 6 first and second years as a college advisor. And every single one of them, I was like, let's meet up like 2 or 3 weeks into the semester and talk about the fact that online learning is not the same as in-person learning, and it takes a different skill set. And I just want to check in to see like, is everything okay? And for like half of them, they were fine. The other half were like, yeah, this is not the same. And I'm like, yeah, let's talk about ways to succeed in an online learning environment when you don't have a desk in your room and you're stuck working at the dining room table. And like with one student, I was like, here's an idea. Buy a very obvious headphones and tell your family, when I'm wearing these headphones, don't bother me. I'm working on school. Those kinds of things, just to kind of help them figure out how to succeed. Because like, yeah, online is different than in person. And I think at least half my students didn't quite recognize that. And I wanted to make sure I talked to them about that. Like if I had a magic wand, that's what I would want to know, how to get every student who needed help to talk to me. Like that, if I had a magic wand, that's what I would want to know. But I have no idea how to even start that research or even identify who those students would be. Like I have no clue. But yeah, if I had a magic wand, that's what I think I would want the most.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's definitely hard to do that, especially at scale with 200 to 300 students. I'm curious though, like if we kind of flip it, what's something that works really well with 200 to 300 students that could also work really well for like small class sizes that teachers might not be aware of?
My favorite is peer instruction and think, pair, share. Like those are my active learning is my favorites. Peer instruction especially, I think is useful because it is immediate feedback from the entire class of whether or not they understood the thing that you just told them. And my dissertation actually focused on how students get questions wrong. So I know a lot about how students screw up. It's fascinating. So that means also I can come up with really good distractors, really good wrong answers for multiple choice questions. Sometimes I even fool myself. When I was lecturing, when I was still like, I think it was the second or third time I was teaching the class, and I didn't yet have the correct answer in my notes. Like I fooled myself a couple times where like I see what the students did. And I'm like, yeah, that's the right answer. I'm like, oh, wait, no, that's not the right answer. Like, because the majority of students chose the wrong answer. And I was like, I didn't pause and go, wait a minute, something's wrong.
And what does peer learning look like? So you mentioned like that as being a strategy. If it's a novice teaching a novice, how does that look in a learning space?
So in a learning space, the way that I do peer instruction is I pose the question to the class via some way that I can collect an answer from every single student. My main way to do it is Google Forms, but there's clickers and there's other ways to do it. And then you look at the results. And if 75% of the students did not get their question right, you're going to want them to discuss with their neighbor what the answer is. And if not even 35% of the students got it right, and obviously these are fudge numbers, you can kind of go up and down if you want. Less than 35% got it right, then you need to give them a hint because clearly they don't understand what's going on. And so after you have them discuss, usually there's some extra things you can do. Like you tell the group, like they have to come to a consensus. They have to agree before we do the second round. And so then you do round two. And round two is you ask them the exact same question. It's like, there's no change, like exactly the same. And then you see how the students did. And so if the students, usually at that point, the students where 75% will have found the right answer. And so at that point, then you go over the answer because clearly some students still didn't get it right. So you go over the answer and you can move on. If they don't, that's a clear sign you did not teach this thing.
Right.
And you need to try again. That I think can work in any classroom. And like watching academic Twitter, like part of me is kind of annoyed. And part of me is like, yes, you have found peer instruction. Because like a lot of them are like, oh, Zoom is great because I can do polls. I'm like, you could do polls in the real world. You don't have to do polls in Zoom only. That mildly frustrates me. It's like, you could have done polls at any time, but you've just discovered them in Zoom. But like, at least you found them now. But peer instruction has been a thing for a long time. I hope you take this into the real world. And like, I think some of academic Twitter basically said like, this is what I'll miss when we go back to the real world. I'll miss polling in Zoom. And I'm like, you can do that in the real world.
Yeah, and peer instruction is one of those things that I personally, when I was asked to teach my peers and I was learning content, I learned so much from doing that. Like it is such a great learning tool, not only for the person who's receiving instruction, but also the person who's like having to do essentially the teaching of it, thinking of new ways to reframe, oh, how do I think of this concept in a different way and whatnot. Like it's very beneficial for everyone.
When you're first doing it, students are not going to want to do it. So you got to nudge them to do it. So like, I guess for anyone who's wants to try this for the first time, like I will tell you now, students will not want to do it at first. And you just got to first set up the expectations that you want them to do this. And then you got to be kind of obnoxious about it. So the way that I did it is that I will wander around the room looking for people who are not talking to anyone. And I will literally sit down and go, hi, what's your name? And it's like, my name is Bob. Okay. And I turn to another student who's not talking. Hi, what's your name? My name is Kate. Kate, I'd like you to meet Bob. Bob, I'd like you to meet Kate. I have made this awkward, but now you could talk about the question. And then I go to the next, and I keep going. And I don't know if this made it into, so Mark Gosdile and I talked about this, I think, in his podcast, on the CSED podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if this made the cut, but he also does something similar, but instead what he does, and he can only do it because he's an old white man. And he said this first. I did not say that first. He walks up to the student and starts singing. That's like the student that's all alone. He's like, you are all alone. And I'm like, yeah, you can only do that because you're a white man who also like does amazing work on the ukulele. He plays the ukulele, so he can actually sing. But yeah, he like slowly walks towards the student and starts like singing, "You're all alone." And the student like eventually like scoots over and goes talk to someone. And then after I think a couple rounds of this, the students kind of get the message and when they see him coming, they'll like start scooting over to talk to somebody.
Yeah, I like that. I like the idea of like, I'm going to do something awkward that makes it so it's less awkward to actually just engage in a conversation with your peer and whatnot. Another thing that I've often had to do is kind of like model and even practice. Here's how you can help somebody. Like, don't just get frustrated with them because they don't understand it the same way as you. Like, here are some questions you can ask and whatnot. So you mentioned your podcast, the CS Ed podcast. I'm wondering, what do you hope other CS educators learn from your podcast?
For my podcast, I made it because I listen to a lot of podcasts and I realized that there weren't many computer science podcasts out there. I found it hilarious that you started releasing yours, I think soon after, or maybe you started releasing before I did. I can't remember. We kind of started releasing our podcast around the same time. And I've actually always been interested in science communication. I watch a lot of science YouTube, so in some ways that's not surprising. And for the podcast, what I wanted was a mix of a couple of things. One was I wanted people to learn more about the research-backed methods to teach computer science. Like I wanted to get the word out there more because especially in higher education, like at least K through 12, like there's so much regulation to make sure that you all are educated enough to like teach kids properly and trained. Like professors, no one trains professors really. The only times professors are trained how to teach is if they're interested in learning how to teach.
Right.
And so one kind of thing that I wanted to happen with my podcast, for example, would be like one goal or like use case would be that like I have my core listeners who are kind of like the SIG-C community. And the hope would be that I'd have an episode that someone in that audience thought was really useful, that they could then tell someone who's not in the SIG-C community, this is a good episode. You should listen to this one, which is why the first season was very targeted towards like tools, how to write a good exam. Like it was very like practical. These are like things that maybe a non-SIG-C person who teaches computer science would also be interested in listening to. And now this season's theme is where should we go from here? To really start thinking about like, given COVID and the racial craziness that's happening, eventually some form of normal will come back after COVID. But where should we make that normal rather than just sliding into whatever normal comes? Let's be deliberate about it. So that this season is more thinking in those terms of like, where should we try to aim to be rather than let wherever we land be wherever we land. So the goals of the podcast are very much this combination of telling people about research in computer science education, getting the audience to think about these things more deliberately, and at the same time also be super practical, because I am an extremely practical person. And so all of the episodes I'm hoping for this season will also include like extremely practical tips that you could start that day. Like right after listening to the episode, you know, an action item that you could do immediately is kind of the goals of the podcast at this point, I think.
And what has surprised you so far while interviewing people on the podcast?
So one thing that I learned during my recording with Colleen, and at this point, I don't remember whether or not this made it into the podcast episode or not, but during my conversation with Colleen, she made an interesting comment saying, you should be embarrassed by how you taught 3 years ago. Admittedly, she tells me this when I've only been like a year and a half into teaching. So like, I have to remind myself sometimes that like, even though I taught a lot in grad school and actually was a TA in undergrad, like in some ways, I've only really been teaching like 2.5 years. At the time, at like year and a half, baby professor me was a little bit like, that hurts. I don't know if that should be true. At 2.5-year-old professor me, I'm like, yeah, that should be true. Hopefully in half a year, I will be embarrassed by how I taught 3 years ago. Very much, this is a marathon and not a race. Or maybe it's not even that. It's a journey. And your goal should always be to continue improving your craft and getting better at what you're doing, knowing that you're never going to be perfect at it. But at least right now, you're good enough because, you know, the students are still alive by the end of the semester and they hopefully learned something. They're still making it through the school and the world. And you just need to get better and better at what you're doing over time, because then you will serve the students that you are teaching in the future even better.
Yeah, I like that. And that definitely resonates. I used to have students who'd come back to classes or ensembles and be like, why didn't we do it this way when I was in it? Well, because I'm continuing to iterate every single year.
Yeah, it's like, I didn't know how to do it when I was teaching you.
Yeah, I'm a bit of like a practice and productivity nerd in that like I'm always trying to refine what I do and to just like be more efficient, whether it be like with my playing or my writing of code or like how I teach or facilitate. I'm curious, like, what do you do in order to like iterate on those abilities, whether it be as an educator, as somebody who can do computer science or a researcher in any area?
So I'll answer that in a couple of pieces. First, I also am a productivity nerd. I love doing that kind of thing. It's kind of fun to pause and ask myself, how could I have done this better? And then coming up with experiments on myself. Like this is the few times where n=1 is okay. Because all I'm doing is experimenting on myself to see if I can get myself to be more productive. And so I do a lot of things there. So for iterating on teaching, I really actually liked the episode that you just released. I don't remember the name of the person you interviewed.
Is it Dan Schneider?
Yeah. So I really liked how he framed your teaching, where like the first thing you have to do is master the content and master like the class management. And then after you do that, then you can start thinking about like class delivery. So like it's phases that you go through.
Yeah.
And it kind of helped me actually give myself a bit more grace because I'm like, I am a baby professor. I'm an assistant baby professor. Like I've only done this for 2.5 years. And making me feel like, okay, so I don't have to do everything perfectly all at once from the get-go. So in terms of improving teaching, I think at this point, I only have one class that I've really mastered the content and the class management of. And I'm only just now thinking about the content delivery part and how to improve those things. Like I recently had someone ask, how do you work on class community? Like, how do you help your students build a community? And I told the person, like, I don't know. Like, I'm going pure on instinct and like a combination of instinct, what I experienced as a student, and like what I wish happened to me as a student. Like, that's kind of what I'm going on right now. Because I'm not at that stage of being able to do that. This is partially, I'm working on a blog post sequence of how I organize the TA team for my 200 plus student class. I did a small release to some people I know. And one of those people asked me that question because I was asking for feedback on those blog posts. And I was like, yeah, I don't know. I wish I knew how to like think through how to build community in my class. But right now I'm not at that part. But I think for me, constantly improving, part of it is reading, doing a lot of reading and reading broadly. Like I'm not just reading the latest research that's out there, because in some ways it's kind of harder to translate the latest research that's out there, but also reading, like I'm currently reading a book called Small Teaching, which is an excellent book. I would recommend it to anyone. I'm also reading a book called Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World, and by David Epstein. And this book has been really interesting because it's making an argument that you should not specialize too soon. And if you think about college in general, college really wants you to specialize as fast as possible. Like that's how you have a major. And every major basically wants to pack in as many of their classes required compared to anything else. And reading that book has gotten me really thinking more like, oh, actually, maybe we should be thinking more in terms of breadth, like trying to help people explore more what they're interested in. And so for me, I'm not just interested in computer science. I'm also interested in data science. Like, how do you teach people data science? And like, what does that process look like? And data science, thankfully, has built into it more a requirement for breadth, because data science outside of any context does not make a whole lot of sense. Like, you need to deeply understand biology, cancer, economics to be able to understand the data science that you do on top of it. And anyone who says otherwise is kidding themselves. If you do not understand your data, garbage in, garbage out. Like if you don't understand your data going in, you're not going to understand the data going out, regardless of what your analysis is. You're not going to recognize a bad result when you see it if you do not understand the context your data is coming from.
Right.
Education, I feel, is one of those fields, unfortunately, that has more trouble with people believing you when you say that, because I call this the educated fallacy. I have been educated, therefore I know how to educate.
Yeah.
And I'm like, nah, no. That's like me saying, I can brush my teeth, therefore I am a dental hygienist. Like,
in teacher education research, that's called the apprenticeship of observation. So you go through like your 12 or 20 years of schooling or whatever, and you think that you have become this master because you've sat through it. And so you're learning from people. And it seems like, oh, this is an apprenticeship. Well, no, you don't understand why they're doing what they're doing, the choices behind that, or the theories that informs what they're doing. And so like you're making assumptions without being able to actually like verify if those assumptions are correct. And so it's an interesting line of research.
Apprenticeship of observation. I'm going to remember this now that I know there's a proper term for it. Because literally I've been making it up. I've been calling it the educated fallacy, especially when I first got into CS Ed. I came at it weird because like I was in a computer science department surrounded by computer scientists. And then I went across the aisle to the education school and was like talking to education professors, but there was no computer science education person to mentor me. And so like my background is weird because like my background is this combination of computer science with human computer interaction and design, and then K through 12 education. Like I went through the literature boot camp of like, let's read all the seminal works of K through 12 education, which has nothing to do with my context of higher education, but like that's what I went through. When MOOCs happened though, it was very interesting being in that position because I felt like I was straddling two worlds. On one side is the computer scientists who also suffer from the eye of a hammer, everything looks like a nail problem, because software engineers especially love to solve everyone's problem with computers. And on the other side, I had the education people who are like, you don't know what the hell you're talking about, and you're trying to tell me what to do, so I don't want to talk to you. And that's why we have terrible education technology in some ways, because the education people rightly did not want to talk to software engineers. And so that they built their own things, which weren't so great because they weren't taking advantage of all the knowledge the software engineers have. And the software engineers are building all these things that are horrible for education because they're suffering under the apprenticeship of observation, because they're like, I have been educated, therefore I know how to teach people. And you're like, no, you know how to teach yourself. Maybe you know how to teach yourself, but you don't know how to teach anyone else. So stop.
Yeah, no, I like that. And it also relates to some of the issues that I see with education in general and research. So like the K-12, what people do, the practices are often disconnected from research. And so the podcast, like the Unpacking Scholarship episodes, try and like bridge that gap and like allow the two spaces to kind of connect with each other a little bit.
Yeah, I do like those episodes. In some ways, I'm tempted to steal or riff it for the CS Ed podcast if I can get more consistent funding. Right. I don't have the skills or the inclination to learn the skills to edit my own podcast, so I have to pay a producer to do it. And I also want to pay myself for doing it. So the reason there's a season 2 is I found a benefactor who is willing to pay for it. So I have another idea also where I know of someone else who is starting a CS Education for Grad Students podcast. And she is planning to pick like some of the top papers that like seminal works in our field and interview those authors and also ask them what really happened.
I like that.
What was the chronology of like what happened when you wrote this paper? And I was like, yes, I want those podcast episodes. Yeah, if she doesn't do it, maybe I'll do that. I don't know.
Yeah, and like tying that back together. So I did that Unpacking Scholarship episode of Nikki Washington's paper that you mentioned. And when I tweeted it out, she responded saying that paper was actually in response to her not getting tenure at her former place. And like knowing that, the what really happened was like, oh, that's fascinating. Like this came out of that. So like a good thing came out of a negative thing. And yeah.
I saw that tweet from her and I was like, oh, interesting. I'm glad you're at Duke now. I like you here. Like, you are awesome. Nikki is amazing.
So one of the questions that I love to ask, and there's a supercut episode that's going to release a couple weeks from now on this particular topic, but how do you take care of yourself to kind of stave off the burnout of what tends to happen with a lot of educators and professors?
So for me, the biggest thing was facultydiversity.org. So it is the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity. And I found this resource, I think after faculty orientation, maybe, which for me was after a semester of being at Duke because I started in the spring semester. And so I went to orientation like a semester late, which actually in some ways is more useful. Like going to orientation after you've been there a semester is you actually know what questions you want answered. And it's a resource intended to help you figure out how to make being a faculty make sense without burning yourself out. So they have extremely practical webinars where it's like, go through this 1.5 hour webinar, and by the end of it, you will have a plan for your semester. And go through this one, and now you will start learning the process of planning your week every single week. And there's a lot of like tips and tricks and those kinds of things that you can do in there. And when I found this resource, I was like, this seems very useful to help me start figuring stuff out. And I was horrible at the beginning of following their advice. Like it took time to figure it out. And I was working evenings and I was working weekends. And I was like, I hate this. One reason actually I decided to be a professor of the practice, and I guess we should define what that is. So a professor of the practice is someone who focuses more on teaching rather than research at Duke University. And there is some expectations of scholarly work, but what's nice at Duke is that we can kind of define what that means to ourselves. And so for myself, my scholarly work is going to focus more on research with some outreach like my podcast, but like some people define it in other ways. And so I chose to be a professor of the practice because I looked at the professors at Berkeley, which was my main way of comparing, my main yardstick, because that's where I went to grad school. And admittedly, it's not the most calibrated yardstick now that I've been away for a while. But I looked at them and I'm like, I don't want your life. I was like, I don't want to work 60 hours a week. I don't want to have this huge pressure of finding grants and publishing. I don't want any of that. I want to have the weekends to myself. I want the evenings for my family. And so that's one reason why I chose professor of the practice, because I was like, I know at least I can do teaching well. And as long as I do that well, they're not going to fire me. And so if I have to like do less of other things to get that work-life balance, no one is going to fire me over it. And anything else I want to do on top of that, like my podcast and my research, I will do because I want to, and it fits into my life. Obviously, though, I did not know what I was doing in the beginning. And so I was still working weekends and all of that. And then adding the practices that I was learning from this resource was great because it started making certain things more visible and more real and helped give me the tools to figure out how to tweak that. So, for example, the weekly planning meeting is where you list out all the things you have to do, and then you match those things to your calendar. Like you literally block out time on your calendar, like this is when I'm going to work on X. Another thing where they have you track your time, like how long does it take you to actually do things? Because everyone suffers the planning fallacy of it always takes longer than you expect it to.
Right.
And so having you track your time helps you figure that out. I am a data nerd because, I'm a computer scientist and a data scientist. So I still collect my time. Like I know exactly how long I spend on everything to the 15-minute increment for work. And I did this in grad school before even learning about doing this as a faculty. So picking up that habit again was very easy for me. So knowing that information, I am better at estimating how long it takes me to do things. I still screw up. Like I estimated for reviewing for 60, it was going to take me an hour and a half per paper. No, it took me like 2 hours per paper or like 2.5 hours per paper. So I was still off, but I was not as off as I could have been. And so like blocking out my calendar. And then in the beginning, it made it very real to me to realize that I was underestimating how long things were taking me because I had to drag those blocks to like the weekend. Like I didn't finish this thing. So now I have to put this in the weekend and now I'm spending weekend time and I feel this pain. I'm going to remember this pain. So I will fix what I'm doing to stop doing this. And it took me like a year before I stopped like working on weekends and working in the evenings. Like we had one kid at the time. So like after the kid was in bed, like pulling up my laptop and doing extra like email and that kind of thing. It took me a long time, but that's kind of probably the biggest things for me, which was like accessing that resource. And a lot of universities have university memberships there. So just check your university and see if it's in that list. Because if it is, then you have free access to all this stuff. Planning out my semester, I go a little crazy in how I plan my semester. I plan it kind of to the hour, how many hours I'm due on various things for various weeks, but like no one has to be as nuts as I am. I do weekly planning. I make deadlines feel real. And so the way I do that is that the act of planning out when I'm going to do what makes deadlines feel very real to me, because if I don't get it done in that time, I have moved everything else over. And that, to me, at least, the deadline feels very real at that point, because I'm like, well, if I don't get this done now, I'm not going to get it done later,
right?
Or I have to shove something else over. So clearly this deadline is real, even though technically I don't have to do this for 2 weeks. 60, technically we're all reviewing for 60 now, and that due date is next week. I'm already done. Because I was like, no, if I don't do this now, I'm not going to get it done later. I've got other things to do. Other things are tracking my time so I know how long things take. And then I kind of mentioned this before. I was like underestimating how long something takes you feel the pain, like make you feel that pain so that you'll reassess how to do better next time. I think it's still a balance. I still plan out my days, and technically my day is supposed to end at 5, but it never ends at 5. It always ends at like 5:30 or 6. And that's partially because I'm a bit of a workaholic. Like I like to do this stuff. And I have the advantage of we live in a place where we can live on one income. And so my husband, he technically is a stay-at-home parent. He supported me a lot in grad school. So I feel like this is like the reciprocal. I now hold the breadwinner bucket, and he had it before. But what that means is like I can continue working in my office until he goes to daycare, picks up the 3-year-old and brings him home. And I don't really have to go downstairs as soon as the 3-year-old is home. I can the 3-year-old can play with his dominoes or whatever. And I will continue like getting rid of finishing some last email. That's how I kind of avoid burnout. And right now also, since I'm on parental leave, I'm currently going through a process now of kind of rediscovering how to recharge because of this combination of being a workaholic and having 2 kids now and trying to manage 2 kids.
That's something that I'm also have been working on since I finished my dissertation is, okay, now how do I have more appropriate balances in my life? Because like I'd finish my day job and then at night I'd work on my dissertation, and on the weekend I'd work on my dissertation, and then I go back to the day job, and it's like, well, where's there time for me to relax and me to spend time with my wife and dogs and whatnot?
Grad school encourages very bad habits.
Yeah.
I'm still figuring out what does vacation mean to me?
Yeah, me too.
Like, I know I should do it, but what do I do during vacation that is rejuvenating? I don't know yet, to be quite honest. And I've been trying for 2.5 years to figure it out. Like, I still don't know.
Yeah, my therapist recommended I take a few days off, so I took like 5 days off, and it wasn't until the 4th day when I actually stopped thinking about work, and I realized just how much I think about work even when I'm not working, and I'll just like write down, oh, I need to make sure I do this, or oh, I like here's a new idea for this thing, or whatever, and it took multiple days to stop doing that.
At this point, at least, between a couple days before Christmas and a couple days after New Year's, I don't work during that period.
Mm-hmm.
Because that seems like a very natural, like, this is sacred. We shouldn't work between Christmas and New Year's if we can at all. But like over the summer, I'm still bad. Like, I'm like, I should probably take 2 weeks off in the summer. I haven't yet. I'm still trying to like, what do I do for vacation? So now I've actually made a pact with my younger sister and a bunch of other friends. Like, when this whole thing is over, let's try and meet in Hawaii. Let's just plan to try and find a place and hang out in Hawaii for a week or 2.
Yeah, well, yeah, don't do it the way I did it. When I was in Hawaii with family, I was working on my dissertation proposal. So like there's a picture where I'm sitting on the beach typing on my laptop. I'm on the beach. Like don't do that.
Yeah, don't do that. The reason I started in spring actually was because I had not finished writing my dissertation. Like I went on the job market the spring before, got the job offer from Duke, and then I was like, I don't want to start in the fall. I want to start in the spring. I'm going to finish writing my dissertation before I take this job. And that made it actually a lot less of a stressful time to write my dissertation, because I had my first child right after the job hunting season. And so I was like, I'm going to take a month off, and then I'm going to finish my dissertation while taking care of a newborn, which obviously didn't work. So my husband actually took parental leave to take care of the kid. But it worked in the end. I got done before it was due.
That's good. So where might people go to connect with you and to listen to your podcast?
So for my podcast, we are the CS podcast on basically every platform. Unfortunately, sometimes the is required, which I think is very silly for a search engine. But if you search for the CS podcast, you should find it. And we have a website, site.duke.edu/CSED podcast. I also have the CSED podcast on Twitter and on Facebook. So all of it is the CSED podcast, unless you're searching for it in some podcasting app, then you might need the, which is frustrating. Twitter is probably another way of contacting me. I am at KSM_CSED, and I tweet a lot of random stuff, I feel like, on there. Like sometimes it's like fun stuff, sometimes it's interesting things that I've found on the internet, or conversations with like fellow CSED people. I think one of my better tweets was actually calling Amy Coe and Mark Gosdell and saying like, when should I publish at a journal? I have no idea. And that was a very nice conversation on Twitter.
And as always, as a friendly reminder, I include links to all of those in the show notes, as well as many of the other topics, books, resources, etc. that were discussed throughout this episode. You can find that clicking the link in the description or going to jaredoleary.com. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you stay tuned next week for another Unpacking Scholarship episode where I talk about implications of scholarship in the classroom, and 2 weeks from now for another interview. I hope you're all having a wonderful week and are staying safe.